Okay. When I found out Ricardo was giving the keynote, I went to Teresa and I said, I don't know if you have anyone in mind, I don't want to step on any toes, but I really want the opportunity to be the one to introduce Ricardo. My name is Gary Guthrie, and I'm not going to list all of Ricardo's accomplishments, but I wrote a little something to keep me on track here. I first met Ricardo in the summer of 1980. I had just started work as a research associate with Dr. Ted Crosby, who, if any of you know Ted, is way up there in Monsanto. Ted and I took pretty divergent paths when we left Iowa State. Ricardo had just arrived to start on his master's or just be master's, and his work was with Dr. Brent Pierce. And Dr. Pierce and Ted both worked in physiology, and as it so happened, they did a lot of work together. And so I was the one that helped Ricardo a lot with his research, and he would help us some out in the fields. What I want to share with you, again, not about Ricardo's accomplishments, but I want to share a story that tells you a little bit about Ricardo's character. We know Ricardo is a character, a little bit about his deeper character. Now, there's nothing remarkable about all of that, except that when you come to understand that Ricardo came to Iowa, and he came to Iowa to work in corn. What most of you, very few of you probably know, is that Ricardo is terrifically allergic to corn. And that's not putting it mildly, is it? Right. And Ricardo would be out helping me pollinate corn, just cover, and he had every inch of, that you saw very little of his skin, because he was just covered with clothes to protect himself a little bit. But he was miserable. Just head stuffed up, just eyes watering, but not once did I ever hear him complain. Now, and he loves corn. He's devoted to corn, was devoted to corn anyway. And you have to be well grounded in your life, in your vision, to do what he did, to come to Iowa State and to do what he did, dealing with, he knew what he was going to be dealing with, never once a complaint. In his book, David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants by Malcolm Gladwell, and just as a side note, the readings in the Catholic lectionary readings 2 days ago was David and Goliath. The author describes a group of starving painters in the 1860s Paris. They were trying to figure out what to do about the Salon, a yearly exhibition of paintings viewed by millions. Yet those deemed worthy was controlled by a select few whose criteria was how real the paintings were painted. I would like to think that these painters, meeting in a cafe to discuss what were they going to do, what should they do, is not unlike Dick and Sharon Thompson and Larry Callum and others getting together 28 years ago to discuss what are we going to do about what is happening in agriculture. Well, these painters took a risk and started their own exhibition, which started on April 15th, 1874, which lasted a month, charging 1 franc for entrance. Well, today we know these painters as Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, and one painter who said, Paul Cézanne. He said, the day is coming when a single carrot, freshly observed, will set off a revolution. Look around you, Ricardo. Look around you this weekend. I believe that day is now. So, from one misfit to another, do I dare say a room of misfits to another one. Ricardo, welcome back to Iowa.
Hello, everyone. I really love that introduction. I think you're right on lots of different counts. Also, I need to tell you, I'm really relieved because of all the stories Gary could have told you. I'm glad that's the one that he chose. So this is a real privilege. It's not only a free ticket to Iowa, which I'll take anytime. It is a real privilege to be back with you and to see how Practical Farmers of Iowa has grown. I want to begin because I wasn't able to be with you during the time that you celebrated Dick Thompson's life. I want to share just a few experiences that I had with Dick. I won't go on about it. I know that you all realize the man that he was. But because this is the opportunity to do so, I do want to share with you that I think of Dick as someone who was a partner during my career at Iowa State. He was always a willing partner to take part in early courses in sustainable agriculture at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, and more than just hosting us on his farm, he was always cheerleading. And I want to do some cheerleading for you today as well. And in just a few seconds, I'll tell you why really all I can do for you is to cheerlead this evening. But focusing on Dick, one of the things that I remember the most about him is that this is where he was always the most comfortable when he partnered in terms of teaching at Iowa State. All of you know he was a farming genius. All of you know that he was a very deep thinker. And I had invited him to come to the classroom and teach there, and once he took me up on that. And I thought he did phenomenally, and he felt very poorly about it. And when we were talking about it after the experience, just simple debriefing, he said, I just can't do that. You need to come out to my farm. He said, that is my classroom. And he's absolutely right. We all know what he meant. That's where he could actually point to the real stuff and he could walk us to the next field. And this posture that Dick has in this particular picture, I think all of you recognize it because his field tours weren't just show and tells. He was actually working through problems, telling you the thing that he was figuring out at the moment, always with his ears open for suggestions that might come from other people, listening with deep respect. All of you know this. I just want you to know that I also saw that in him and appreciated that. He did this not only with other farmers, but with students. As I was looking through pictures that we collected in that period of time, I thought this was a nice one. It's totally accidental that Greg Shepard, with his back to us there, had that epithet on that t-shirt, "Find a Way," because that actually was the spirit of that farm and that man, as you all know. And here you see Sarah Carlson, who was going to go off and do great things, and is still going to do great things in front of her. And this is the way I think of that man: effervescent, cheerful, open, giving, sharing. And he lives on in all of you and in what this organization will do. So I wanted to be able to share that sentiment with you because at a distance I felt that, and didn't dream at the time that I read the very sad news and followed as well as I could what was happening in terms of memorializing him and celebrating his life. It wasn't quite the same as being with all of you. So now I need to tell you why this is such a difficult thing to do and why I concluded that I'm just going to cheerlead the work that you do. And that is that when I thought about this, I realized that I have a shtick. And my shtick is that because I actually studied agriculture formally, I live in a world of agriculture advocates. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them are from outside of the world of agriculture. So my shtick is to speak with authority from within the world of agriculture to folks who want to see a different type of agricultural system but don't come from it. So there's something that I can say to that crowd. there is absolutely nothing I can say to you folks. Because you folks are the doers. You're the folks that teach the rest of us. Just as I scan the room right now, I actually see a lot of my heroes, including the guy that just walked off here for lots of different reasons. So you're just going to have to accept that I'm just very humbled by the privilege of being here and saying a few words. Now, I want to share with you an experience that I had very recently. With the Union of Concerned Scientists, one of the responsibilities I have is that every once in a while, the union, which is supported primarily by memberships, but also by targeted giving, we don't take corporate funding, we don't take government funding. It's very important that we be very independent in terms of making our analyses, our judgments, and advocating for the points that we do. So we depend on donors who support us. Every once in a while there will be a very generous donor, and it's very important for program directors to make the visit with the donor when the cultivation has reached the point where it's possible to close a deal. So I was visiting with a donor, very special donor, the sort of donor that had just given the Union of Concerned Scientists $1 million, just like that. And I was instructed that this was a very sharp guy who noticed that the Union of Concerned Scientists had a program in food and the environment, and he had developed an interest in food and wanted to speak with me. So I go off and speak with the fellow, walk into a room. The fellow must have been all of about 33 years of age. And we sat across the table, and I found out that he was a fund manager. Now, very sharp individual, accustomed to asking direct questions and getting direct answers. And so I want to share with you the question that he asked me. It was a very pointed thing, and it did set off a productive discussion, but it also set off a very involved chain of reflection that I've essentially been continuing for several different months, and it was this. So what is the thing that we need to fix with agriculture, in so many words? But he didn't stop there. He said, is it one of two things? You know, so he lives in the world where you make things as concrete as possible, and then you get to work according to the answers that you are pursuing. And so he suggested two things. So is the deal with agriculture that there's something that we don't know that we need to find out, or is the deal with agriculture that we already know something that we're not acting upon? Now it's a rich reflection. Remember, for somebody whose world is not agriculture, but had become very interested in food. And of course, one way in which I am similar to you is that we all see that there could be a better system of agriculture in the future. We all envision that. There's a difference in between people like me who are merely advocates for that and people like you who do it, who are experimenting and figuring it out. But nonetheless, we share that perspective that we want to see a different kind of agriculture. And so I'd actually be very curious to know what is going on in your own minds with respect to this question. But I had a reflexive answer, and the reflexive answer is that we will always be able to learn more, but knowledge at the moment is not what is limiting our ability to improve the agricultural system and the food system that depends upon it. So we went that direction. So, and what I would like to do is maybe embellish this a little bit and talk about the fact that it is not only something that we already know that we're not doing, it's that we're not doing enough about this stuff that we already know. And that's actually what I want to develop. So, what I want to do before I get to that is to talk about how we ended up with the system that we have right now. Now, this may turn out to be a deadly exercise here with such a knowledgeable group as this, but in a way this will be sort of like church, you know, where we affirm kind of our worldview, and you know, kind of repeat it and make sure we're really believing the same thing. And you know, hopefully then it'll make sense to talk about this thing that we all know that we're not really applying sufficiently. So there was a time, of course, where there wasn't sufficient production, where it really limited, where it was the main preoccupation of us all, where the way in which we spent our days in a gendered way actually was either producing it or processing and preserving it. And that began to shift in a period around 150 years ago. There's actually lots of different threads that we could claim with the beginning of this. I'm going to choose the one that starts with Abraham Lincoln in the 1860s, making a series of decisions after having spent his childhood and youth as a full-time agriculturist at the pointy end of a team of horses. And you can tell from the writing that Lincoln did subsequently and before he became president, and from the speeches that he made on the stump while he was campaigning, that during that period of time, this individual was reflecting, and that in summary, he must have been saying to himself that there had to be a better way. And normally there's some passages that I'd love to read, but that really would feel like preaching, and I'll just summarize them to you. But some of these passages in which he wrote were passages where he reflected and extrapolated to what today has become agricultural engineering, where he pondered about the efficiency of the energy that was expended to feed the animals that then had to drag metal implements, and then how much of that was actually going to be consumed and how much of it was to feed their power, those animals providing traction, and then how much of it actually was going to get retained by the farmer. He also thought about the fact that the weedier the field was, then the less productive it was, and that it would be ideal if you had nothing but the solid crop without the weeds in it from the standpoint of efficiency, because then everything that you harvested would be the grain. And to make a long story short, you can read these things that he was thinking of and realize that today, as a result of Lincoln taking action when he got into a position where he could do something about the things that he wondered about, there has to be a better way than this, all of us are beneficiaries. But it has been a national project that required investment and intentionality. And so what I mean by this very specifically, all of you are familiar with the story, this is kind of like the doxology of the agricultural story, but you know that one of the things that he did was found what is today the United States Department of Agriculture. Prior to this, as many of you know, what passed for the agricultural responsibility of the government was to have someone over in the patent office who collected seeds from different parts of the country and the world and kept a catalog of them. So he founded the United States Department of Agriculture in 1862. This was also the year in which he signed into law the Morrill Act, which actually several people had attempted to push prior to this, but he was the person that signed it into law, establishing this national network of schools who had as the purpose both to democratize education for a population that at that time was primarily farmers, with the goal of improving the quality of their lives through knowledge, and to generate improved agricultural knowledge and extend it. Eventually that mission of extending it became a very important part of it, and here's yours. Also, the year following, and this is a period of time where I won't go into the story, but all of you know the story, the man had a few other preoccupations on his mind during this period of time. And so he also created the National Academy of Sciences with the express purpose at a time when where what we take for granted now as scientific knowledge really was a novelty. And he gave it pride of place by establishing an academy whose specific objective was to inform the decisions of the Congress, such that when there were decisions that needed to be made where science had something to do with the decision or with the subject matter, the best quality of information could be used in order to formulate that decision. That was the ideal, this advisory role. And so all we need to do is to fast forward on the results of this particular project and that intentionality. Remember, this is public investment. You all remember this was the period of time as well when time disappeared in the sense that it became very easy to traverse from one end of the continent to the other, where mechanization was brought into being, where refrigeration made it possible to take the produce from one part of the country through the other, where the technology that originally was designed for wartime was turned to peacetime, where hybrid vigor was developed even though we don't still understand it, learned enough to manage it, create it, and use it. Where the technology of wartime, such as, for instance, fertilizer science, was developed from bombing technology, where pesticides, some of them were developed from chemical warfare knowledge. And all of this eventually came together in the post-World War era, in the 1950s, early 1960s, into this greatly productive miracle that over the last 50 years has made this particular part of the world and other parts of the world that are relatively homogeneous or can be homogenized so that you can apply this kind of technology extensively, because it's very expensive, so you need those broad acres in order to be able to justify it. This has been the paragon of productivity. So there was intentionality. There was a reason why productivism was pushed. All of this was a result of thinking about the question, why isn't there enough, and how can we solve that problem? And doing that at scale. So that mission, in a way, has been accomplished. And as you all know, everyone in this room is here because you recognize that in addition to that, there have been other consequences that have come hand in hand with doing things intensively at scale and through this particular methodology. So one of the things that I want to point out, and here I wonder whether we'll begin to hear some sour notes in the choir singing the doxology here. I want to focus on this particular early part where it appears that nothing is happening for a few decades after the establishment of those institutions, where in fact there is a great deal of variability. And some of that variability at that time means that those are hard times in farm country. But in fact, after this period of time, after that takeoff occurs, when all of those pieces of national investment and intentionality and effort come together to create this productive machine, the big problem of this agricultural system, even unto itself, not talking about the externalities, was overproduction. And figuring out how, after we'd established this machine to be so efficient in terms of producing as much as possible per unit of land, per unit of labor, what to do with the stuff that was overproduced because we could produce it. So, you know, that there were many answers devised to solve that problem. So all the way from school lunch programs, the dairy program, there's all kinds of plastics that are a result of that, alternative energy, sweeteners, biofuel these days. All of these answers to the question, we've got all this corn, what do we do with it? Now, which is an important way to look at this, because that's the reverse of the way in which the justification for this huge productive machine is often framed. The issue is overproduction. We've learned how to do this very well, and we're overproducing. The fact that that overproduction occurs with great environmental cost, with great socioeconomic cost, almost beggars the imagination, because we're talking about overproduction. So unnecessary production. So now, this is the point to be real careful about, and where I said it's important to maybe note to see whether we've got some sour notes in terms of the choir singing the story here. You know that science was a huge part of this. That's actually the setup I've given you here. But in fact, a huge part of this was actually a partnership with a set of policy supports that actually propped up the system so that it could continue to perform when by market forces this would not have developed. By market forces, overproduction would lead to surplus, low prices, and a completely different narrative. But because of the fact that we had this hugely productive machine, then export markets needed to be developed, and of course farmers on their own weren't going to be able to do this. There needed to be a policy infrastructure set up to do that. So there's another way to look at this story, which is the policy narrative that goes hand in hand with it. One place to begin that particular narrative is to pick up the thread of the policy of, first of all, acquiring the land, the ground floor, literally, for this productive machine. One of the pieces of legislation that enabled that was very transparently and helpfully named the Indian Removal Act, beginning on the East Coast, but then progressing to this period of, to this area of the country, a systematic elimination of the native holders of the territory. So today we decry land grabs in Africa. That's what happened here. So there were some very deliberate actions that took place in order to set the platform for this productive miracle to occur. Homestead Act and allotted those appropriated lands to individuals. Many of you descend from folks that homesteaded in this part of the world. You know what the conditions were for that, improving the land, maintaining it for 5 years. And then there were a series of farm support programs that were put in to help farmers when the prices fell because of overproduction. Remember, this was the problem from the very beginning. And this is too small for you to be able to read, but in essence, these cartoons from the early 1930s are talking about the government steamrolling over market principles, and they're appealing to the fact that socialism is being established on the economy of the country. So this was seen from the very beginning of farm programs. And this before farm programs became systematized. There's very little point in going through each of these methodically, but periodically these mechanisms have been refined as we've learned more. So should we support prices? Should we set a floor for the prices? Should we set a ceiling for production? Should we require that there be conservation or other kinds of conditions set for people that are receiving government supports? How is it that we can control supply? How can we create new markets for this tremendous bounty that's generated? How can we improve the quality of life of people out on the farm? This is why you find rural electrification programs in the farm bills the last few decades. How can we supply alternative uses of this material? All of this with investment from the public, which is why that public has a right to demand that that investment serve the public good. Now, so I don't know how we're doing with the doxology, but so obviously here we got into some different interpretations of the story. But this is my rendering to set up why we're not using certain knowledge that we have. So this is a quick summary of that. You have entire courses here. One important part of this story is how we have been transformed over this period of time. One of the consequences of this has been that fewer and fewer of us have remained on the land, farming. The majority of us have moved to cities and very much severed our ties with the farm. Don't think very much what's happening out there. What happens on the farm is essential for us to do what we do, but we don't think about it. The crossover for this happened in the first third of the prior century. And so we've become completely disconnected from this. But this productive machine is one of which you can all be justifiably proud, is a productive machine that is actually emulated throughout the world. You know places in South America, places in Central Europe, certain sections of Australia where there's been great success in emulating the model that was established here. Well, what I want to expand on is that we have learned a great deal over this period of time. What comes to mind immediately is, going back to that original question, is it something that we don't know that we need to figure out, or something that we know that we're not actually using or acting upon? Well, we've developed a lot of technological knowledge. This is what comes to mind immediately. So as you continue to file all the different categories of what we learned during this period of time, think of what was learned during the Second World War and how it was not incidental that after learning how to move large pieces of material, a fuel supply, moving food all over the world to keep an army in the field, we learn global logistics and can do that for other purposes after that period of time. So that same knowledge, that same logistical expertise in peacetime has led to the establishment of this global food system that we all are now beneficiaries of, and which allows the majority of us to not think about where that food comes from. It just materializes whenever we wish for it. Within a few minutes of our thinking of it, we can have whatever we want. So we've developed a great deal of logistical knowledge to enable that. And of course, a great deal of economical knowledge to decide how best to invest resources in order to make all of this possible went hand in hand with that. And the narrative, at least according to what I've described to you here, also demonstrates that we've developed a great deal of political knowledge. Not policy per se, but political knowledge, whereby that I mean the ability to direct resources, public resources, to support particular purposes and particular institutions. So that power to take limited resources and apply them to particular goals. We've learned a lot about how to do that, how to favor certain outcomes over others. So the system that I've described is a result of applying all of these different kinds of knowledge. So no problem applying that kind of knowledge. Here's what we're not doing enough of. You may say this is a long way to go to get to this point. It's agroecological knowledge. There's a little bit of that if you are a successful farmer, you apply. But there is a whole lot more of this that could be applied, and which I would argue, and this is not a difficult audience I know to make this argument, this is the key to long-term sustainability in agriculture. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. So we learned a great deal as a result of this public investment to generate the productive machine that I just described right now very quickly. So one of these is the quick answer to what agriculture actually is. So, you know, there's a superficial way in which we could talk about seeds and tractors and fertilizers, and that's not it. Those are tools that enable agriculture. But I'd like to illustrate this by thinking a little bit about this river delta, or asking you to take a look at maybe this more illustrative picture here, which is of a Piedmont. And what you have in this Piedmont, this is in the United States, in the Coachella Valley in California, is a very graphic depiction of something that most of us as little kids saw happening and maybe even played with in the sand pile. If you had a hose and you like to move the sand around with water, what you see here is the force of water, natural rainfall over a very long period of time, moving large quantities of soil, organic matter, detritus, and concentrating that in the easiest pathway downhill, so that there's this concentration of this rich material, which is more fertile relative to the land around it because it has been concentrated from all of these different areas. And both those river deltas and these Piedmonts are the places where the style of agriculture referred to as runoff agriculture is practiced to this day, and which was the original type of agricultural system. So we learned how to do this in places where natural forces accumulated the basic resources, the water, the nutrients, the organic matter, the fertile soil, in order to enable greater productivity than we would have found simply by walking over a particular area to gather nuts, to gather tubers, and so on, and feed us in that manner. So nature did most of the work, and particularly in a way that, if you think about this a little bit, you notice this kind of dynamic is occurring whether human beings are there to intercept it or not. This is occurring regardless of human activity. And it continues to occur even when humans intercept it and benefit from that enrichment that is occurring due to natural forces. So the majority of this work is done. Humans intersect with it and benefit from it. This was the model of agriculture. That's why it was better than doing the additional work to gather over a larger area of land. As a matter of fact, there are anthropological studies that take a look at the period of time when this happened, and it actually happened over thousands of years because people fell upon it at different times in different eras of history. As a matter of fact, some gatherers survived until very recently in history. This is the century in which it's very likely that they will all disappear. But over a period of 10,000 years, different groups of people arrived at utilizing this particular dynamic at different times. And the anthropological studies show that there is actually a particular threshold where what you obtain in agriculture actually compensates for the effort, the labor that you put into gathering that actually makes the agricultural activity more successful. So, interesting tangent, but the important thing is that this is a natural process. Most of it is the force of nature. If you wanted to have a measure of the value of this, one very crude way of measuring it is just actually to ask yourself, if we had to artificially do this mechanically, you know, say with bucket loaders and with trucks to move all this material around, you can immediately begin to visualize the amount of energy and the amount of work that it would take to replicate what natural forces are doing over a period of time. Well, so translate that into what agriculture is. So in essence, we do exactly that same thing. But in a situation like the one that you see here, the difference now is that we don't just, you know, find a naturally occurring Piedmont or a naturally occurring river delta where natural forces are doing that. We actually do the work of concentrating that. And so we utilize energy in order to move material, so nutrients, energy, and concentrate them in the areas where we stage agricultural activity. A much more expensive enterprise. Just go back to that analogy of having to do the work that natural systems do, replacing it with backhoes and with dump trucks and so on. So, but we do this as long as we have access to the energy that actually justifies the entire enterprise. And so, without belaboring that point, then this is viable as long as there are big holes someplace else in the world, you know, so in the panhandle of Texas Texas and Florida, southern Canada, in Morocco, where we can go get the potash, where we can go get the phosphate rock. And so as long as those holes exist, estimates vary from about 80 to about 350 years that they will last for that period of time, that system is viable. And of course, the energy that actually justifies that, that sustains that, is a product of the oil exploration industry. So particularly fixing atmospheric nitrogen, the way that we obtain it these days, takes a tremendous amount of energy. And so as long as we have places like this where we can continue to extract that energy, then that system will be viable. I want to address something very important here, which is actually the equation for this has changed greatly over the last decade. And there's no point in spending a whole lot of time on this. All of you are very aware of it. You know that in groups like this, we used to talk about the fact that this is the era of peak oil. Kamyar, who was sitting someplace in here, had my favorite expression for this period of time being the happy time of the fossil fuel era. And the way in which this equation has changed is that it seems like the duration of this period of time will be extended. The reason for that, you know about the fracking boom, there's a little bit more to it than that. It turns out that there is still no universally either understood or accepted explanation for how oil is formed. Now, all of you are familiar with the stories of, compression of ancient tropical forests and dinosaurs and so on. There's still not a satisfactory explanation for how these vast deposits of fossil fuel were originally created. But the interesting thing is that not all of that occurred simultaneously, so that it happened at different rates in different parts of the world and is still occurring in different parts of the world, such that what we refer to as different grades of crude oil actually refers to different pools in the stages of the formation of oil. And the current state of that science is that utilizing some of that fossil fuel energy, you can accelerate the formation of some of that not quite yet oil. And when you add up all of the reserves that we can estimate at the moment exist, with which we can do that, now the equation shows maybe another 600 years rather than maybe another 150 years of that fossil fuel era. Now, the interesting thing is, for those of you that are familiar with the thermodynamic argument around the viability of ethanol, biofuel, is that it's that story, using some of the fossil fuel in order to generate more fossil fuel. But nevertheless, for the rich and powerful of the world who can actually enforce their control over those pools of fossil fuel, there may be about 600 years worth of it. So then that means that we extend maybe by a factor of 4 the window during which it's possible for these kinds of systems to occur. So the window is extended. The logic of using the resource consumptively is unaffected. So at some time, it will be the case that it will be more expensive and it will run out and it will not be viable. So as long as all of these resources exist, then that system is feasible. Now that means that the contest, in order to be able to support these kinds of agriculture, is the contest for the access to that oil. So if you know how to read the headlines around the globe, those headlines scream at you, this is what the world's geopolitical dynamics are all about. Positioning for oil, positioning for water, positioning for productive land, positioning for access to the mineral nutrients that then subsidize the productivity of the agricultural areas of the planet. That's the game. If you have the power to impose your ownership over those resources from around the world, you will become obese and die of cardiac arrest because you ate too much. For those of us for whom that system doesn't work, we don't have the power to assert that control over those resources, then there is hunger. And that's the way it is for about 1 billion people on the planet at the moment, including 50 million people embedded in this country. The most productive agricultural power in the world has 50 million people with the kind of access to food that you would see if you went to places like Haiti and some corners of Kenya and so on, which should be something that no American ought to be able to live with. But this is a separate topic. So, let's talk about what to do about this. This is where I have come to cheer you on, because this is what you do. So at one level, how can we utilize agriculture or agroecological knowledge in order to be able to utilize the forces of nature in such a way that it saves us from using the fossil limited supply sources of energy and accomplish as much productivity. And so here's another place where Iowa leads. Some of the foremost researchers in answering that question are here. All of you, I'm sure, could tell me more than the reverse about Matt Liebman and his team's work in lots of different areas, but probably the most emblematic piece of research is the work done at the Marsland farm over a long period of time, involving rotations to demonstrate that utilizing agroecological techniques, cover crops, rotations, the standard biological tools in agroecology, you can achieve as much productivity at less cost. And of course, the significant finding here is that about the only indicator whereby you have to expend more in this kind of system to attain the same level of productivity is that you do need to invest more labor. I know all of you in the choir would know what to say about the fact that this requires more labor and how that could possibly be interpreted as a negative of the system. So this is not the crowd that needs preaching about that. So this is one of the ways in which that can be done. Another way in which I was leading the way, many of you I'm sure know, and some of you are actually involved directly in the work of the team that is led and coordinated by Lisa Schulte-Moore. You'll recognize this wonderful picture of the STRIPS project, where what they are demonstrating is that both perennializing a row crop system and maintaining cover and alternating areas of the cultivated area, you can be highly productive. You can have different sources of productivity and a more resilient system. So it's comparable in productivity, but it is a more resilient system on several different indicators. Lisa was telling me that Seth Watkins is the first farmer cooperative that's adopting and testing the system. I don't know whether Mr. Watkins is here. But this is an example of a leading system of how you apply these agroecological techniques. Now, this may be perfectly evident, but I want to make sure that I underscore it. In the system, as I described it earlier, there is kind of an overstatement. This industrial system that I described earlier, there's kind of an overstatement of the fact that it is a system. And I want to be really clear about that. So if you talk to an engineer, that engineer will tell you that a system is a set of parts or components that work together in a coordinated way to give you a particular end, a particular result. So there is a system in that industrial system, but that's why we use that term. It is an industrial linear system. You collect your resources from point A, they go into a box, you get a product at the other end of that box. And there's no regeneration of the resources that are involved. As a matter of fact, there is a denuding of the resources that you actually consume in order to feed the machine. And the excess that escapes out of the box, which is not the saleable product, then becomes a problem, a pollutant. So there's an industrial system there for sure, and there's an economic logic to that system. There's a set of values that justify that system. But if you look at it through the lens of biology, of what a farmer is in many ways, which is basically a manager of biological processes, you're working outside, you don't have full control out of the resources available to you in order to produce, then that is not an agroecological system, because by that definition of a system, there are no parts. The parts are industrial. You buy these things off the farm, and the farm happens to be the staging place where you attempt to recoup the investment in those external purchases. So in the agroecological setting, then what you do is create the parts. There are predator-prey relationships. What you do is to manage the quality of the soil. It's the foundation of everything. And in Iowa, the key thing to remember is that if there's anything that distinguishes this soil in terms of its fundamental assets, that soil is to Iowa the way that oil is to Saudi Arabia. It is the basic wealth that the state has. And as opposed to oil, you can actually manage soil in such a way that you not only conserve it, but you can build it. So when you have the parts in the system whereby you can regenerate the resources, again, taking advantage of the fact that you're not investing external energy, but utilizing the processes that nature actually has, where you maintain pest pressures low, where you don't create the niches where weeds can express, where a variety of different species growing simultaneously actually make it more resilient, help you to conserve soil, help you to conserve water. You're all the experts in that sort of stuff. Then you have parts. Then you can make a system. So this is the thing that I wanted to emphasize. Now I want to appeal to something that is a little bit more pie in the sky. So there is concrete research in strips and studies like the Marsden experiment that will show you how you can sort of take the system as it exists and improve it, bend it more toward the agroecological end. But here is a challenge, a vision. I wonder how many of you share the vision, even though all of us understand what the obstacles are to it at the moment. You know, there's a very real sense in which we can go to any of the other 98,000 farmers in the state who aren't in this room and talk to them about hypoxia, and all of them can look at you straight in the eye and tell you truthfully, I am not responsible for hypoxia. Because individually, they're less than a drop in the bucket. No single farmer can account for that effect. But as you all know, I wish I could remember the first place that I heard this, there actually is a place where that non-point source pollution becomes point pollution. And that is at the place where a watershed contributes its water load to a new river. So at that point, then you can identify that sedimentary load and its phosphate and its excess nitrate came from this watershed and all the farmers in that watershed. And what that means is that the excess of nutrients that are imported, that are purchased from a great distance, and because we have economic power to do so, it's appropriated from another part of the world, brought, transported here, invested here, mismanaged in such a way that, this is no joke, you know that Iowa State itself has done the research. If the nitrogen is applied, we could go through each of the macronutrients and talk similarly, but just on nitrogen, the research done at ISU demonstrates that the application rates are such that you can lose a half to in the extreme 3/4 of it and still make your yield goals. That's the logic of the application rate. You're just going to secure the yield goal. And because no one pays for the fact that there's going to be some stuff, you know, going out through the tile and accumulating out on the surface of groundwater, then, you know, that system is justified. You've assured your yield goal. So the stuff coming out at the other end is a huge problem. There's a huge inefficiency in lots of different ways, but here I've just established or shared with you what the economic logic is for that. But if you buy that premise that at the level of the watershed, there is a way to get a hold of what the contribution is to rivers further downstream or waterways further downstream, and if there were rewards and incentives for farmers to work together at the watershed level in order to improve the environmental performance of their watershed, here's the vision, here's the question, the curiosity. Are we sufficiently motivated? Are we capable to both generate those kinds of systems the way that we've made out of whole cloth the set of policies that I showed you in a blur that have created that system that we have right now that produces too much of the wrong stuff, not enough of the right stuff? I'm sure we can do that. These policies, I'll have a little bit more to say about that, essentially create that envelope within which we create the choices that we can make. And if we shift our values such that we say, all of us working together at a watershed level can improve the performance of our watershed, there's already administrative units that you can all imagine, you know, soil and water conservation districts. I'm sure you're all thinking about different ways in which you have communities of interest, communities of practice, where you could meet and talk about the way that this could happen, and then appeal for the kinds of policies that would support you to do that. I wonder how many of us think that that's a viable way of actually addressing this issue without actually inculpating any single individual, but actually incentivizing individuals to work together for this particular goal. And again, I stress, not altruistically, but with rewards and incentives for doing that in a way that is concrete and that we can all understand. So operating at the level of a watershed could be this kind of a paradigm or a new way of thinking in terms of providing the incentives and the rewards for different performing agricultural systems. One last thing about things that we could do more of that I'll just very quickly describe. There's a very interesting story for why we plant in rows. It was actually the innovation of a gentleman farmer in central England in about the 1700s, when the farming population here was coming over from there and bringing in what was called literally the new fashioned horse-hole plowing. Many of you may know the story of Jethro Tull, but in just a very short rendition of it, this is a gentleman farmer with gout. There's a landed gentry, decried the demands of his labor force, wanted to mechanize in order to replace his labor, use horses to do that, replace broadcasting with row cropping so that the horses could get through, and had this theory that fertility had to do with pulverizing the soil because, don't you know, the way that plants eat is through small mouths in the roots, therefore the finely ground soil is more digestible by those roots. And he was confirmed in his suspicion when he ran trials and determined that in rows you actually got bushier stands of wheat, more seed heads, therefore greater yield, therefore of course it was the more pulverized soil and the horse hoeing that made his fields more productive. It was actually the greater seed heads that were able to tiller because of the row space that then allowed them to branch. So this we know now, but that's the story of why we plant in rows. When Gary mentioned to you this obsession that I had that brought me to Iowa, absolutely one of the best decisions ever in my life. It brought me into contact with many wonderful people, many of you here, people like Gary and many others. And I did learn everything that I wanted to learn about corn, but I left the Extension Service in Texas. And it was just well known that I was nuts. I mean, I'm reasonably obsessed with corn. And one of my colleagues at the Extension Service at Texas A&M said, "I'm sure you'll become famous. I'm sure we'll hear about you when you figure out how to grow corn upon corn." 2 stories of corn. And he thought he was being funny about that. So let me go back to agroecology. There's this discourse about the demand for more food. So let me just quickly say, my narrative here has been that we overproduce. We all wear it. We make ourselves sick because we produce too much, we eat too much, and too much of the wrong stuff. That's the story. We produce way more than this planet needs in order to feed everyone. The narrative about having to produce more so that everyone can eat is false on its face value right now, because right now we already produce more than is needed, and we don't need to produce more in order for the people who don't have access to food to have it. You have to ask, why is it that people who don't have food don't have it, and then work on that. And as I've insinuated earlier on, it's power. It's basically the access to productive resources. So I won't go into that, but the point that I want to underscore is that from an agroecological standpoint, there actually is a more efficient way of producing than this row crop, homogeneous monocrop system, and it does involve storage, and it's an ancient way of doing agriculture, and it is modeled on biological, natural models. And this multi-storied agriculture actually takes advantage of the fact that there's a different light environment or radiative environment the deeper you go into a canopy, and there are species that are adapted at each layer of the canopy from the top down to the shaded level, down to the ground, and below the ground, and there are many examples of systems like that. And there are ways of comparing the productivity of those systems versus equal systems where you just do the monocrop in order to produce the same amount. And to just give you a few random figures, the productivity of those systems can range anywhere from just a little bit more productive to about 6 times more productive, both per unit of land and labor, in terms of producing actual food. So actually the frontiers of producing more, if that's what we needed, and I'm arguing we don't, we need to produce the right stuff. We need more good food, not more food, and we need more justice so that people can access or produce that food for themselves. But if it were a matter of having to produce more, that can be done on a smaller footprint with less environmental impact through agroecological principles, and I know that you folks are the experts in that. So I want to leave you with some cheerleading here. This is an Ola Hormel poster that I just love, and there can be great truth to this. If you'll allow me to get personal here, I know I've shared this story with some of you. You'll just have to bear with me if you've heard it before. But as Gary said, I came here originally from Texas, but prior from that, I came from Mexico. I was born and raised in Mexico. That's part of the reason I was obsessed with corn. And so, but I came at a time when I was already baked. I was a teenager. So that means even to this day, I still see the United States through the lens of somebody that was just born someplace else. So, that's just natural. And here's the thing that I see about Americans. Americans are never happy. Americans are never satisfied. So, the examples that are just common are that, you've finished doing the remodeling of your home, and already you're thinking about what you could have done different. So next time when you redo that porch, or when you repaint that rocking chair, this is what you're going to do. So there's, very little of sitting down, sipping your lemonade, relaxing, saying, boy, that was good. It's, I didn't think about that. Next time. That's the American spirit. And so with agriculture, and I say this to you in the most genuine way, because it may sound sappy. That's actually the narrative that I see that's available. You folks are doing research and development to answer questions that humanity will have, even in the short term. So you will be ready with the answers for how to produce in a different, more environmentally responsible and productive way. So in agriculture to the moment, Americans, as a result of the story that I just relayed to you, have solved many significant problems, reduced drudgery, learned how to operate at scale, and learned how to be very productive. And that is not enough. It's sort of like, next time. And it needs to be done in a way that you minimize environmental damage and actually build the environment, and that the product is healthful. That's the American thing to do. Thanks.